They sold her for less than the cost of a sack of flour. No one raised a hand, not until a tall, quiet rancher stepped forward without even looking at her face. The onlookers called it pity, but to Margaret it felt like the last nail in the coffin of a life that had been nothing but loss. 50 years old, worn by winters, she'd never chosen cast aside for giving birth to the wrong children, 3 girls, and now standing in the dust like something unwanted at the edge of the market. When Elias Carter led her away, he didn't speak more than a handful of words. No questions about her past, no promises about the future. He simply bought her, handed over the 2 worn bills, and said, "Let's go home." But home wasn't what she found at first. The ranch was lonely, the walls cold, and the man who'd bought her seemed more comfortable with silence than conversation. And yet there were small things. A cup of coffee left steaming by the stove, a fence mended without being asked, the way his voice softened when speaking to the horses. Still questions gnawed at her. Why would a man buy a stranger without seeing her? What had he lost, and why did his eyes carry that hollow ache? Then came the first crack in the quiet. An envelope slipped under the door. No return name. Inside, one line. "She doesn't belong to you." Who sent it? What did they want with her? And why did Elias's jaw tighten the moment he read it, as though the sender wasn't a stranger at all? The days that followed were a slow unspooling of truths, neither of them meant to share, of memories that still bled when touched. Margaret found herself wondering if this $2 bargain was actually a bargain at all, or if she had just been traded from one cage into another. But there were also moments, a laugh she didn't mean to let slip, a morning when the smell of baking bread filled the kitchen and she realized it was her own hands that had made it, a night when Elias stood at the porch rail looking out over the dark and said quietly, "I didn't buy you to save you. I bought you so you could save me." Still, the past doesn't loosen its grip easily. A shadow on the ridge, a voice from the life she thought she'd left behind. And the sudden sinking question, if they come to take her back, will Elias fight for her or let her go? Would you stay to find out what happens next? Because this isn't just about a $2 sale in the dust of a Western street. It's about what happens when two people, both unwanted, begin to see themselves as worth keeping. By the time the gavel came down, the wind had picked every pocket in Ash Fork clean. It moved through the makeshift auction yard like a thief with soft hands lifting hats and taking the warmth from people's lips. The livery cast a long, splintered shadow over a line of crates and coops and one milk cow too old to be proud of. Folks came for harnesses, for spare hinges, for gossip. No one came for a woman. Margaret Ellison stood with her chin tucked into a shawl, darned so many times it looked like a map of all the places she'd been torn. 50 years old, though, a hard winter could make you guess a few more. Her hair, corn silk, gone to wheat, was tied at the nape, and her hands had the patient stubbornness of someone who had boiled wash for other people's lives and then hung those lives on a line. The sheriff, who was a decent man on Sundays and a practical one the rest of the week, cleared his throat. Lot 37, he called, not quite looking at her. Household effects of 1M. Ellison stove kettlebread pans, Bible hymn book, 3 quilts, and the labor of the owner for a term not to exceed 6 months to satisfy debt to the mercantile. Someone in the back coughed. Someone else laughed, a small sound that tried to hide inside the wind. Margaret didn't flinch. She'd learned that lesson young. If people were going to treat you like an object, the only power left was to remain a person. "Do I hear $5? The sheriff tried. Silence, the kind that reveals more than it covers. A boy of maybe 16 raised a hand halfway and then let it fall. His father shook his head. An older woman near the chicken crates crossed herself. The mercantile owner, Mr. Pike, looked bored, as if this moment were a chore beneath his ledger. One said a voice, and someone snorted as if the number itself had slipped on the ice. The sheriff's jaw worked. $1 bid. "Do I hear 2? Came another voice, low, and even from the edge of the crowd where the road met the December sky. The words arrived without a flourish, like a hand offering a mug of coffee instead of a toast. Heads turned. A man sat his horse a little apart, hat brim pulled low against the light. There are men the West carves like stone, and men it whittles to a fine line. This one seemed a bit of both. His coat was worn but mended by hands that respected fabric and time. His horse, a grulla mare with wise eyes, flicked an ear and settled as if the two of them had held still for a lot of storms. Sold, the sheriff said too quickly in a voice that sounded grateful to be done. The gavel came down on a crate lid. A nail popped free in protest. Someone grumbled, "Fool paid $1 more'n she's worth." But even that sounded thin, like it didn't believe itself. Margaret lifted her eyes to the rider. He didn't meet them. Not yet. He dismounted with the deliberate economy of someone who knew the price of wasted motion. When he reached her, he took off his hat, not as an apology, but as recognition. "My name's Elias Hart," he said. "I've got a small spread west of here. I could use help I can trust. You'll have wages, your quilts, and your Bible. You'll have keys to your own door. No one touches what isn't theirs. Words can be offered like coins or like water. These came like a canteen in a dry month." She swallowed. "For how long till your debt's done," he said, "or till you decide you've paid enough?" The sheriff handed her the folded receipt like a benediction relief washing his face. Mr. Pike scowled as if someone had snatched a coin from between his teeth. A woman in a blue shawl stepped forward, curiosity beating kindness by a nose. "He bought you without seeing your face," she whispered. "Why would a man do that?" Margaret turned the question over gently as if it were a fragile egg in her palm. "Maybe he was looking for hands," she said softly, and trusted the face would be human. Elias did not hurry her. He stood like a fence post sunk true, willing to wait for roots to decide which way to grow. When she gathered her quilts and hymn book, he took the heavier crate without asking, like a man who had learned you don't measure courtesy by how loudly you announce it. They walked out of Ash Fork with eyes on their backs and dust lifting around their boots. The mare took their pace as a given, not a complaint. At the edge of town, a gust lifted Margaret's shawl and slapped her cheek with her own hair. She smiled at the wind, an old familiar adversary, and tied the knot again. "Why $2?" she asked when they'd put a field between themselves and the crowd. "I had two," Elias said, the hint of a smile in his voice, but not on his mouth. "And you aren't a $1 story." They said little for the first mile. Sometimes silence is what two people share when they haven't yet decided how to say thank you, and I'm sorry, and I don't know what comes next. As the road climbed, the livery roof shrank to a splinter behind them. The horizon opened like a door on a hinge that hadn't been oiled in a while. Prickly pear crouched under their own shadows. A hawk wrote a single sentence across the sky, and then didn't need the rest. The land carried the same scarred beauty Margaret had felt in her own chest, not pretty, but true. "You've got folks?" Elias asked at last, as if he were inquiring about whether he might be walking into. "Once," she said, and left the word where it lay. "I was promised at 15 to a man who spoke to me like I was a barn he'd had his eye on. I was obedient. I learned to make bread that rose no matter who had fallen that day. He wanted sons. The Lord gave daughters to my sister instead, and a quiet to my house you could hear the kettle through. He didn't offer pity. It has a sound pity, like a boot scraping a step. What he offered instead was room. And now he asked, now I have a name and a shawl and a debt, and a pair of good hands." She looked down at them, speckled with flowers' memory, lined with labor's prayer. "They shake less when they're busy." "I can do busy," he said, "and I can mind my own business. A beat. I can also cook a little." She turned her head, surprised, into a small laugh that felt like a door opening in a warm room. "Can you chili and cornbread? The cornbread's better. I won't take it personal if you say so." They crossed a dry wash where cottonwoods kept secrets the way old widows do, by knowing how to nod and keep quiet. Elias Mayer picked through the stones without complaint. He reached a hand back without looking and steadied Margaret as she stepped from one rock to another. His touch was firm and brief, like a man shutting a gate so calves don't wander. Far-off blue mountains held snow like they were remembering something cold and necessary. Closer by, the land lay in winter colors, sage and shadow, and the brown of a loaf taken out of the oven, a breath too soon. "What do you want me to be?" she asked suddenly, the question too quick for self-protection to stop it. The wind carried it a little, as if the sky wanted to hear too. Elias's answer came without rust. "Yourself," he said, "and safe." Safe. The words set down on the road between them and chose to walk along. They reached Hart's place by late afternoon, a square of fenced earth, a barn that leaned like a tired man, but refused to sit a cabin with a porch that creaked in friendly complaint. The kind of place that had been built more than once, not because it fell, but because a man kept learning how to do it better. Elias set down her crate just inside the door and tugged the latch twice. "It sticks," he said. "Like me." Margaret stepped in. The room smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and the faint pine of soap. A worn Bible sat open on the table, Psalms, the comfort food of Scripture. She touched the back of a chair as if greeting an old acquaintance who changed his hat but not his eyes. "You said I'd have keys," she ventured, not quite daring to believe. He reached to a nail by the door and handed her a small iron ring with two keys that didn't match, but belonged to each other anyway. "House and cellar," he said. "And there's a room yours, if you want it, on the north side. Light in the morning, cool in summer. I put a hook behind the door for your shawl," because he stopped as if he'd said too much, and then finished simply, "It's a good shawl." She closed her fingers over the keys. Weight can be a comfort if it isn't a chain. They worked in companionable quiet. She unpacked the crate tin cup comb, the little jar of buttons every poor house owns like a bank of second chances. He brought in water and laid a split of wood on the fire, like he was laying a blanket over someone who'd fallen asleep in a chair. Supper was as promised, chili and cornbread, the latter slightly sweet, the kind that forgives a long day. They ate at the table with elbows on wood and gratitude held lightly between them. Elias bowed his head before the first bite, not because he wanted to be seen as a man who prayed, but because he was. After she washed dishes and he dried, and two people who had known too much loneliness learned the soft music of plates and patience. When the stars had come in 1,000 small witnesses with cold noses, Margaret stood on the porch and watched her breath become part of the night. The yard held the day's footprints like a promise to remember. She thought of the auction yard, of the price the world had set, $2, and of the way a man. That first night under Elias Hart's roof, Margaret lay in the narrow bed of the north room, listening to the timbers breathe. The walls held the faint scent of cedar and sun-bleached cotton. Somewhere outside, the mare shifted her weight, the creak of saddle leather echoing faintly in the barn. Margaret kept her hands folded over her stomach, not because she was praying, though maybe she was, but because after years of other people deciding what her hands should do, it felt strange to have them idle. She thought about the word safe. Elias had said it like he meant it, not like a promise he couldn't keep. But safety is a slippery thing for a woman who's never been allowed to hold it for long. She was used to waiting for the crack in the doorframe, the raised voice, the bargain she never agreed to. Morning arrived with the light Elias had promised, the pale gold that slips in without asking, casting the quilt in gentle squares. She rose, dressed in the same faded calico she'd worn to the auction, and made her way to the kitchen. Elias was already there, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair damp from the pump out back. He was frying eggs in a skillet, older than both of them, moving slow like a man who'd learned that rushing only got you burnt yolks. "Coffee's hot," he said without turning. "Mugs are in the cupboard. Help yourself." Margaret hesitated. No man she'd known had ever told her to help herself to anything. But she did, pouring the coffee, dark and steady, inhaling the steam, as if it might wake the part of her that had been sleeping for years. They ate in comfortable silence. Elias didn't fill the air with questions, and Margaret didn't fill it with apologies. There was a steadiness in that, a rhythm she didn't have to keep up with, only walk alongside. After breakfast, Elias showed her around the ranch. The barn leaned, but the beams were sound. The chicken coop needed patching where a fox had tested the wire. The garden lay brown under frost, waiting for the thaw. "This place was my father's," Elias said, adjusting his hat against the sun. "Then mine. It's never been much, but it's honest. I keep it running. It keeps me breathing." Margaret nodded. She understood bargains like that. They passed the small cemetery on the west hill, two markers weathered but cared for. Elias stopped a moment, his voice low. "My wife Annie and our boy Samuel, both gone the same winter. Fever took her, fever took him." Margaret didn't offer condolences. Words felt too small for the shape of grief she saw on his shoulders. Instead, she rested her hand lightly on the fence post between them, a silent, "I hear you, I see you." By midday, she'd found her way to the kitchen as naturally as if the boards remembered her step. She scrubbed the counters, set the bread to rise, and discovered a row of canning jars tucked on the highest shelf, dust-covered but still good. She made a mental note to fill them come summer. Elias came in wiping his boots on the porch mat. "You work like the house owes you money," he said with a half smile. Margaret glanced over her shoulder. "Idle hands have a way of remembering things I'd rather forget." He seemed to understand. "Then I'll make sure there's always something to do." It was a simple exchange, but it held a weight and unspoken agreement that busyness could be a kind of mercy. That evening, the wind came down from the hills sharp and thin. Margaret stepped onto the porch shawl tight around her shoulders. She saw Elias at the woodpile splitting logs with measured swings. It wasn't just the strength in his arms she noticed, but the patience, the way he seemed to wait for the axe to tell him where the wood wanted to break. And for the first time in years, she realized no one here was going to demand more of her than she was willing to give. The thought was so foreign it felt dangerous, as if believing it too quickly might cause it to vanish. But she tucked it away like the first green shoot under frost, waiting for a safer season to grow. That night, as she lay listening to the wind in the eaves, she thought of the auction yard again, of the eyes that had looked past her, the voices that had measured her worth in half-dollars, and of one man who hadn't even asked to see her face before deciding she was worth more than the lowest bid. In a world that had always wanted proof before offering trust, that felt like the rarest kind of gift. She didn't yet know what Elias had seen or hadn't seen that made him bid those $2, but she was beginning to wonder if for the first time her worth might not be something she had to prove at all. 3 weeks passed and Margaret had begun to move through the ranch like water finding its natural course. The mornings had a rhythm, firewood, first coffee brewing in the dented percolator bread dough, set to rise while the sun eased itself over the far ridge. Elias spoke little at breakfast, but his silences were never heavy. They were like the quiet between verses of a hymn, pauses meant for breath, not judgment. Yet even in the safety of these days, Margaret felt the old restlessness that twitched beneath her ribs that told her not to get too comfortable. Safety, she'd learned often, had a short lease. One afternoon, while hanging wash on the line, she saw a figure on horseback far out past the cottonwoods watching. The distance swallowed the details, but she felt the weight of the gaze. The rider didn't approach, only lingered until she looked too long, then turned and disappeared into the hills. She said nothing to Elias that night. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because naming a thing made it more real. But the next day it happened again. This time the rider was closer, and she could see the glint of a brass button catching sunlight. Military issue. Her throat tightened. That evening, Elias came in from the barn with a coil of rope over his shoulder. He noticed her stillness at the sink, the way she held the dish rag like it might fray apart in her hands. "You look like you've seen something," he said quietly. Margaret hesitated, then told him about the rider, how both times he'd been just far enough to watch without being called out. Elias's jaw tightened. "Could be someone passing through," he offered, but there was an edge under the words. "I don't think so," she replied. "He's looking for something. Or someone." They both knew what she meant. That night, Margaret dreamt of her old life, not in full scenes, but in fragments. A slammed door, a fist on the table, her first daughter's cry, thin and bird-like, her second, her third, each one met with the same bitter curse from the man she'd been bound to. 3 girls and not a son among them. When she woke, the lamp by her bed was cold and the wind outside sounded like boots in the dirt. The following morning, Elias saddled his horse before breakfast. "I'm going to ride out past the ridge," he told her. "If someone's watching this place, I'd like to know who." Margaret wanted to protest, but something in his voice stopped her. He wasn't acting out of suspicion of her, he was guarding what was his. And though she had not thought of herself as belonging to anyone in a long, long time, the thought did not chafe as it once might have. He returned near midday dusk on his coat expression unreadable. Over coffee, he said only, "No one out there today." But tracks near the north pasture, heavy boot tread, not ranch work. Margaret wrapped her hands around her mug, letting the heat soak into her palms. There was something she hadn't told him yet. The name of the man she suspected might be behind those boots. The same man who had stood silent at the back of the auction yard arms, crossed lips pressed tight when no one had bid higher than $2. Her late husband's brother. The one who had called her cursed for giving the family nothing but mouths to feed. That evening, she found Elias on the porch carving a piece of cedar into something that might one day be a bird. She sat beside him, the air cool and scented with sage from the hills. "There's something I should tell you," she began. And she did, about the years of trying to please a man who measured her worth in sons, about the day she was cast out, about the way her brother-in-law had looked at her with the same hunger someone might give a horse at market. Elias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down the carving and met her gaze. "He won't take anything from here," he said. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. But in the quiet that followed, Margaret felt the stir of a question she didn't dare voice. What if he comes not for the girls, not for the land, but simply to remind her she doesn't get to keep anything for long? She swallowed the thought, but it lingered like a splinter under the skin. Somewhere beyond the hills, a man who once decided her fate was drawing closer. But this time, Margaret wasn't alone. The question was, would that be enough to make him turn back? The wind shifted 2 days later, bringing with it the metallic scent of rain and something else: hoofbeats. Not the steady, familiar rhythm of Elias's gelding, but the uneven pace of a horse not meant for ranch work. Margaret was hanging damp laundry when she heard it. Her hands stilled on the line clothespin between her fingers. The sound drew closer, then stopped somewhere between the barn and the tree line. She could feel eyes on her before she saw him. The man sat astride a dark bay coat collar, turned up against the wind. Even from here, she could see the bristle of his jaw, the way his hat brim cut a shadow across his eyes. When their gazes met, something old and sour coiled in her chest. She knew that stance, that stillness. Her late husband's brother, James Rourke. He didn't call out, didn't tip his hat, just looked at her as if measuring a field he meant to claim. Then with a slow pull on the reins, he turned his horse and trotted back into the cottonwoods. Margaret kept the sight to herself until supper. The stew between them went cold before she spoke. "It was James," she said finally. Elias's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "You're sure I could pick him out in a crowd of 100, she replied. "I saw him watching from the trees." Elias set his spoon down, leaned back, and exhaled slowly. "I'll have words with him if he comes back." Margaret shook her head. "Words won't change what he's come for." The next morning, Elias rode out early to check the far pasture. Margaret stayed close to the cabin, an unspoken instinct keeping her near the walls that had begun to feel like protection. By noon, the sky broke open, rain coming down in silver sheets. That was when the knock came, 3 sharp raps against the door. When she opened it, James Rourke stood there, dripping boots, leaving dark prints on the porch boards. "Margaret," he said, voice like gravel. "Didn't think you'd land on your feet after that mess." She didn't answer. He glanced past her shoulder, as if expecting to see her daughters. "You've got something that belongs to the family. I've come to take it back." "There's nothing here for you," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her pulse. His eyes narrowed. "We'll see." Elias returned just as James swung onto his horse. The 2 men locked eyes, silent, assessing. Elias dismounted, walked to the porch, and stood beside Margaret without touching her, but close enough for the message to be clear. James's gaze flicked between them, his mouth curling into something halfway between a sneer and a smile. "You'll regret crossing me," he said, then spurred his horse and disappeared into the rain. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The walls creaked under the wind, and every sound from the yard sounded like a boot in the mud. She thought of leaving, slipping away before James could make good on whatever threat he carried in his eyes. But when she pictured walking away, she didn't see freedom. She saw the cabin door closing behind her. Elias's quiet at breakfast, the smell of coffee in the morning, the way the land looked just before dusk. She wasn't ready to lose that. Not again. Elias found her sitting at the kitchen table just before dawn, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He only said, "If he comes back, he won't find you alone." It was the way he said alone, not as if he was claiming her, but as if he was promising to stand between her and whatever came. The man who once decided she was worth less than a sack of grain now knew where she lived, but this time she had someone willing to stand beside her. Would that be enough when James Rourke returned? 3 days passed without sight of James Rourke. It should have been a relief, but Margaret felt the quiet as a tightening rope rather than a gift. The weather had cleared the air, warm enough to carry the scent of sagebrush, but every time she stepped outside, she caught herself scanning the tree line. On the 4th morning, Elias saddled his horse to check the north fence line. Margaret wanted to tell him not to go, but the words wouldn't leave her mouth. She watched him ride away his back straight against the horizon until the dust from his horse faded into the shimmering heat. By noon, she heard the hoofbeats again. This time, they didn't stop in the trees. James rode straight into the yard, his horse's hooves churning up dry dirt. He dismounted slowly, eyes never leaving hers. Margaret stayed on the porch, one hand on the doorframe, the other hidden in her skirts where Elias had left the revolver. "Thought I'd give you another chance to hand over what's mine," James said, stepping up onto the first porch step. "I told you before, there's nothing here for you." He tilted his head as if amused by her defiance. "You always were stubborn. That's why no man wanted you. Until now, I suppose." Margaret's fingers tightened around the revolver's grip, but she didn't move. James took another step up the porch boards, groaning under his weight. "Where are the girls, Margaret?" His voice was soft now, almost coaxing. "You can't hide them forever, and you know as well as I do you can't protect them." Her throat went dry, but her voice came steady. "They're not yours. They never were." Something flickered in his eyes, anger, or maybe just the pleasure of pressing an old bruise. Elias's voice cut through the air like a sudden crack of thunder. She said no. Both of them turned. Elias was standing in the yard reins, in one hand, rifle in the other. His shirt was dusty, sweat darkened at the collar, but his stance was solid. James smiled without humor. "You think you can keep me from my own blood?" Walker Elias took a step closer, his voice low but clear. "I think you're mistaking possession for love. And I don't take kindly to men who come uninvited to my place, talking to a woman I care about like she's property." Margaret felt the words like a hand steadying her from behind. She stepped down off the porch, moving to stand beside Elias, not behind him, but level. "She's not going anywhere with you," Elias said. James's gaze flicked between them. "Then you've chosen your trouble." The standoff stretched long enough for the air to thicken. Finally, James mounted his horse, leaning down just far enough to let his words carry. "This isn't done." He turned and rode out the way he'd come, dust hanging in the air, long after he was gone. Margaret exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. Elias lowered his rifle but didn't look away from the road. "He'll be back," he said. "I know," she replied. But for the first time, she didn't feel like running. That evening, Elias fixed the front latch and checked the rifle twice. Margaret made supper, her hands moving out of habit while her mind replayed the moment she stepped off that porch. Standing beside Elias had felt different. Not like being defended, but like being seen as someone worth defending. James had left for now, but his words clung like burrs in the hem of her thoughts. When he came back, and she knew he would they be ready to face him together? The day James returned, the wind had been restless from morning to dusk. Margaret felt it in her bones the way some women feel rain in their knees. Elias was repairing the chicken coop by lamplight when she insisted he come in for supper. They just sat down when the sound came, not hoofbeats this time, but the dull thud of boots in dirt, slow, deliberate, too heavy for a stranger just passing through. Elias set down his fork, eyes narrowing. "Stay here," he murmured, but Margaret rose too. She reached the rifle, leaning by the door before he could stop her. The knock was soft, almost polite. Elias opened the door with the barrel already up. James stood there, hat in hand, smiling like a man who thought he had already won. "Evening," he said. "Thought we could settle this without all the posturing." Elias's jaw tightened. "You can turn around and settle yourself right back on that horse." James ignored him and looked at Margaret. "You think this place makes you safe? A name on a bill of sale doesn't change who you are to me." Margaret stepped forward, the rifle steady in her hands. "I am not yours, James. I was never yours. And if you think you can take me from here, you'll have to walk through the man who bought me for $2 and the woman who was worth far more than that." Her voice didn't shake. For the first time, James faltered. He hadn't expected her to stand in the doorway, not shrinking behind Elias, but holding her own ground. "That rancher," James said, gesturing toward Elias, "he doesn't know you like I do." "The things you stop," she said sharply enough to slice the air. "You've had your say for half a lifetime. I'm done listening." The silence that followed was the kind that shifts the weight of a room. Elias didn't move, but his eyes flicked toward Margaret, a faint nod that said more than words could. James's jaw worked, but he stepped back. "You'll regret this," he muttered. Margaret raised the rifle just enough to make her meaning clear. Only thing I'd regret is letting you believe you still have any claim on me. He left then, boots crunching against the gravel, the wind swallowing the rest of him. Margaret didn't lower the rifle until she heard the faint scrape of saddle leather in the distance. Inside, the lamplight flickered against the walls. Elias turned to her slowly. You didn't need me to speak for you tonight. She met his gaze. Maybe I just needed someone standing next to me who believed I could. Something unspoken passed between them. Something warmer than gratitude, deeper than relief. For the first time, Margaret felt like this ranch wasn't just a place she'd been taken to, but a place she was choosing to stay. The past had knocked, and she'd answered on her own terms. But could love grow from the ashes of survival? Or would the scars always remind her of what came before? Winter gave way slowly in the high country, like an old man reluctant to rise from bed. Snow still clung to the shadows of the cottonwoods, but the air smelled faintly of thawing earth. Margaret stood on the porch with a shawl around her shoulders, watching Elias mend the corral fence. It was the first morning in weeks where the wind didn't bite, and she could hear the hens clucking in a lazy, contented way. James hadn't been back. The quiet was no longer the brittle waiting kind, it was a quiet they'd earn. Elias caught her watching him and grinned faintly. You're starting to look like you belong here. She tilted her head. And what does belonging look like? He paused, leaning on the fence post, like someone who knows the ground under her feet is hers to stand on. That afternoon they worked side by side, she tending to the garden beds, he sanding the rough edges of the porch rail. It was simple work, but Margaret found herself humming, not out of habit, but because she felt like it. At supper, Elias set something small on the table between them, a folded square of blue calico. She opened it to find a length of ribbon worn but neatly pressed. It was my mother's, he said. Thought maybe you could use it for your hair or however you like. Her fingers traced the fabric. It's beautiful. It's yours, he replied simply. She didn't answer right away, her throat ached too much. But later that night she tied it in her hair before bed, just to feel the weight of the gift. Spring arrived in earnest a few weeks later. The grass grew high enough for the horses to graze. The creek ran quick and cold, and the air was full of the smell of pine sap and damp earth. One evening as they watched the sun drop behind the ridge, Elias spoke quietly. I bought you for $2, but what I've been given, he broke off, shaking his head. I don't think I'll ever be able to measure it. Margaret smiled at him, a real unguarded smile. You don't have to measure it, Elias. Just live it with me. The last light caught in his eyes, and for a long time they just sat, letting the silence say what words couldn't. The past was still part of them, but it no longer owned them. Sometimes hope doesn't come roaring in. Sometimes it arrives like the first warm spring after a long winter. Quiet, steady, and certain it's here to stay. She had been auctioned off for less than the cost of a sack of flour. Now she was worth more than either of them could put into words. But what happens when the heart learns to love again without asking permission? Sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the places the world has already dismissed. Margaret thought her worth had been set at $2. Elias thought he'd already lived through all the love he'd ever get. But together they learned something timeless, that real value isn't measured in money or youth or what others think you deserve. It's found in staying when it would be easier to leave, in listening when words are hard to come by, in letting someone see your truest self and watching them choose you anyway. Maybe you've had seasons where you felt like the world passed you by. Maybe you've been told you're too old, too broken, too much, or not enough. But friend, hear this. Your story is not over. And sometimes a second chapter can hold more tenderness, more depth, and more love than you ever imagined in the first. Here on None, Wild West Saga. We tell these stories for hearts that still believe in second chances, no matter how late they come. If this story touched you, I'd love for you to subscribe, share it with someone who might need the reminder, and leave a comment below. Tell me, would you have stayed if you were in Margaret's shoes? Do you want more stories like this, where the heart heals in its own time, and the West holds space for love to grow? I'll be here ready for the next story. Until then, take good care of yourself.